The city was a tapestry of faded brick and cracked sidewalks, a place where each worn-out street corner whispered tales of hardship and hope. In the midst of concrete decay there was a pulse, a quiet, unyielding beat of resistance that threaded through every alley and storefront. Even as the weight of neglect pressed down on the neighborhood, a promise of change shimmered in the small acts of defiance seen on every block. At the heart of this urban sprawl stood an aging courthouse, its stone facade a relic of a time when justice was more a word than a reality. Its imposing arches and cold, unyielding steps had witnessed countless judgments that favored power over truth. Every day the courthouse loomed over the community, a stark reminder of an institution mired in outdated beliefs and systemic bias. Alongside the courthouse, vibrant murals brightened the grey canvas of the city. Bold splashes of colour and stirring slogans, painted by local hands, transformed tired walls into silent protests. These works of art spoke of a people's determination to rise above the scars of discrimination, serving as both a visual cry for justice and a beacon of communal hope. Amidst this landscape of grit and rebellion walked Marcus, a determined teenager whose eyes shone with an inner light that defied the darkness around him. Though his steps were measured and his expression thoughtful, one could see the weight he carried, the unspoken burden of being the voice of his community, the hopes of those who had long been silenced by prejudice. Marcus was not merely a boy with potential, he was a prodigy in the making, whose brilliance in the realms of debate and critical thought promised to challenge even the deepest-rooted injustice. At home, the small apartment hummed with both love and the persistent echoes of struggle. His mother, tired yet resolute, would often remind him, "Marcus, you carry our dreams in your heart. Every time you stand up, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for every one of us." Her words, spoken with both tenderness and urgency, were a constant reminder of the responsibility Marcus felt. His mentor, Mr. Johnson, an older gentleman who had once fought against his own share of injustice, would add, "You have a gift, Marcus. Use it to challenge those who think they can crush us with their hate. Remember, every spark of knowledge can ignite a flame of change." Even as these voices of encouragement filled his days, the shadow of the old system loomed large. In the corridors of the courthouse, Judge Thompson, renowned for his rigid adherence to outdated prejudices, ruled with a dismissive tone that cut deeper than any gavel's blow. His words were measured and cold, and in every curt dismissal Marcus sensed an echo of a history steeped in injustice. "I have no time for sentimental notions of fairness," Judge Thompson would often say, his voice as icy as the marble that lined his chamber. To him, the law was an instrument of control, and the faces before him were nothing more than numbers in a biased ledger. News began to spread about a controversial case that promised to shake the very foundations of this broken system. A local worker, a respected member of the community, had been wrongfully dismissed and vilified, an injustice that was all too familiar in a city where prejudice reigned. As the case drew nearer, the murmur of discontent grew louder in the streets. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, discussing the case in tones filled with both anger and cautious hope. One humid evening, as Marcus walked home from school, he found himself in a small, dimly lit cafe where community members often met to share their struggles and dreams. In the quiet corner of the room, an elderly man with deep-set eyes leaned forward and said, "This case, it's more than just one man's fight. It's a mirror, showing us all how deep the rot of our society has grown." Marcus listened intently, feeling the weight of those words settle over him like a challenge. He wondered if his own voice could ever be strong enough to break through the silence of injustice. Later that night, as he sat by the window in his modest room, Marcus wrestled with his inner doubts. The reflection in the darkened glass showed a young man burdened not only by the expectations of his community, but also by his own fears. "What if I'm not strong enough?" he whispered into the quiet. But the thought of giving in was quickly countered by the memory of his mother's determined smile and Mr. Johnson's encouraging words. "You must rise, Marcus," echoed in his mind. "Even a single spark can set the world aflame." Determination began to kindle within him. The spark of controversy that had ignited public outrage was now fueling his inner transformation. He resolved to dig deeper into the case, to study every detail and expose the truth hidden beneath layers of prejudice. In the days that followed, Marcus pored over legal documents and records, his room filled with the rustle of papers and the quiet hum of determination. Every fact he uncovered was a blow against the injustice that had long plagued his community. In hushed conversations with Mr. Johnson at the local community center, Marcus shared his findings. "There's a pattern here," he said, his voice trembling with both excitement and apprehension. "Every decision, every ruling, seems designed to keep the powerful in control. But I believe that if we bring these truths to light, we can change everything." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with pride. "Your work is not just for you, it's for all of us. This is how we break the chains of prejudice, one truth at a time." As the day of the hearing drew near, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The worn streets, the defiant murals, and the silent protests all converged in a single moment of anticipation. Marcus felt the rising surge of hope mixed with the dread of what lay ahead. In the quiet before the storm, he stepped forward with the resolve of someone who knew that his journey was just beginning. In that moment, every lesson learned, every word of encouragement, every tear shed in silent struggle, converged into a single call to action. Marcus's heart pounded with the knowledge that he was not alone, that the dreams of an entire community rested on his young shoulders, and as he prepared to confront a system that had long thrived on bias, he knew that his journey was not just about fighting for justice. It was about igniting a change that would resonate far beyond the cold walls of the courthouse. The transformation was in motion. With a quiet strength and an unwavering spirit, Marcus embraced the challenge ahead, determined to rise against the tide of prejudice and carve out a future where every voice was heard. The journey toward justice had begun, and in the stillness of that charged night, the spark of transformation was lit. Marcus trudged through the crowded streets on a humid afternoon, each step echoing with the weight of a system built on bias. In his neighborhood, the everyday slights and harsh words were as common as the cracked sidewalks and faded billboards. On his walk home from school, he overheard a heated conversation outside a small convenience store. Two men argued in low, bitter tones. "I don't see why we even try to help them," one muttered. "They never amount to anything." A passer-by, catching fragments of their words, shook his head. "Not everything is as it seems. They've got talent, if only you'd give them a chance," he replied, his voice laced with defiance. Marcus's heart clenched at the familiar sting of prejudice. He remembered similar remarks at school, dismissive comments about his abilities, low expectations because of the color of his skin. These voices of hate blended with the everyday hum of the city, a constant reminder that the road to equality was long and rugged. At school that day, during a quiet moment in the library, Marcus sat hunched over textbooks, the pages blurred by fatigue and lingering thoughts. His friend, Tasha, slid into the seat across from him. "Marcus, you look lost in thought," Tasha said gently. "What's on your mind?" Marcus sighed, setting his pen aside. "It's everything. The way people talk, the way they look at us. I keep thinking, why is it so hard to be seen for who we really are?" Tasha nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know it hurts, but remember, every insult is just noise. Our strength is in how we rise above it." Their whispered exchange underscored a harsh reality. Prejudice was a constant force in their lives. Yet, in the midst of this everyday cruelty, small acts of courage flickered like sparks. In the school hallway, a teacher once had the courage to stand up when a student made a racist remark. In the community, neighbors quietly supported each other, sharing stories of hardship and hope. After class, Marcus found himself wandering to a community center, a modest building that served as a gathering spot for local residents. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with determination. An older man, Mr. Johnson, sat at a corner table surrounded by a few community members discussing recent injustices. "We have to keep fighting," Mr. Johnson declared, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Every day our people face discrimination, but we are more than the sum of their hate. We are resilient." Marcus approached, his curiosity mingled with the pain of the stories he had heard. "Mr. Johnson, do you really believe we can change things?" Mr. Johnson looked at him with kind, knowing eyes. "I believe that every act of courage, every time you speak out or stand up, is a step toward a better future. You have the power to be that change, Marcus." These words resonated deeply with him, stirring both hope and a fierce determination to prove that his community was not defined by the narrow limits imposed on them. Later that night, as Marcus sat in his small room, the quiet was broken only by the soft rustling of papers and the steady hum of his desk lamp. His thoughts drifted back to moments when he had been belittled, when snide comments had reduced his dreams to mere whispers. In the flickering light, he recalled an earlier incident, a flashback that burned vividly in his memory. It was a day in middle school when a classmate had sneered, "You'll never be anything more than a statistic, Marcus." The words stung, echoing through the corridors of his mind like a relentless drumbeat. Yet even then a small flame had ignited within him, a promise that he would not be confined by others' narrow views. As days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. The growing anger and frustration within him battled with the fear of making waves. One rainy afternoon, while studying legal documents at the community center under the watchful guidance of Mr. Johnson, he hesitated before voicing a thought that had been churning inside him. "Mr. Johnson, do you ever feel scared? Scared that if we speak out, everything will fall apart?" Mr. Johnson leaned in, his face earnest. "Fear is natural, Marcus, but silence only gives power to those who thrive on hate. You must choose, not just for yourself, but for all of us. Your voice is the spark that can set our world on fire, in a good way." Those words nudged him toward defiance. The controversial case that had recently erupted in the news, a case where a respected local worker was wrongfully fired due to blatant discrimination, had caught his attention. It was a mirror reflecting the systemic injustice that plagued his community. Marcus felt a surge of purpose. He resolved to dig deeper, to gather every piece of evidence that might expose the corruption and bias lurking in the system. In the following days, Marcus became consumed by his quest for truth. He pored over old court records, studied legal precedents, and spoke with anyone who had suffered under the oppressive rulings of Judge Thompson, a man infamous for his cold, dismissive approach to cases involving minorities. One evening, as the moon cast a pale glow through his window, Marcus dialed the number of a woman who had once stood up in court against injustice. "Mrs. Carter, it's Marcus. I need to know what you experienced that day," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt. Her sigh was heavy with memories. "Marcus, I remember the judge's sneer, the way he cut me off when I tried to speak. It was as if my words were unworthy. I felt so small, so insignificant." "I won't let that happen to us again," Marcus replied firmly. "I'm collecting every detail, every testimony. Together we can show the truth." Mrs. Carter's voice softened. "Then do it, Marcus. Fight with all your might, because our silence has hurt us for too long." Late nights became his companion. In a small, cluttered room filled with stacks of documents and scribbled notes, Marcus worked relentlessly. The soft scratch of his pen against paper was punctuated by moments of quiet frustration when the truth seemed buried under layers of deceit. Yet with every page he turned, every record he uncovered, his determination grew stronger. One particularly long night, as he reviewed a series of court decisions, his mentor, Mr. Johnson, called him. "Marcus, how are you holding up?" Mr. Johnson asked, concern coloring his tone. Marcus hesitated before replying. "It's overwhelming, sir. Every document I read confirms what I already suspected, that our system is rigged. But I can't stop now. I have to keep going." "Your perseverance is the light in this darkness," Mr. Johnson said warmly. "Remember, every truth you uncover brings us one step closer to justice." As Marcus's research deepened, a clearer picture of the systemic bias emerged. Patterns of discrimination, once hidden in the fine print, now stood out in stark clarity. His findings revealed not just isolated incidents, but a deliberate practice of favoring the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. With each discovery, his anger transformed into resolve, fueling a quiet revolution within him. The community began to take notice as well. In hushed gatherings at local diners and small churches, residents spoke of their shared experiences. "We've been pushed aside for too long," one man declared during a meeting. It's time we hold those in power accountable." Marcus listened to these voices, each story echoing his own struggles and igniting a collective fire of determination. "I believe we can change this," he told a small group one evening. "When we come together, our voices become louder than any lie told in court." One chilly morning, as the first hints of spring touched the city, Marcus received a tip from an anonymous source. A sealed envelope, marked with urgency, arrived at the community center. Inside, he found documents that could be the breakthrough he had been searching for. A secret piece of evidence that tied the judge directly to corrupt practices. His hands trembled as he read the details, each word a confirmation of the injustice he had witnessed all his life. "Mr. Johnson, you need to see this," Marcus urged during an emergency meeting at the center. "This is it, the proof we've been fighting for." Mr. Johnson examined the documents carefully, his eyes widening. "Marcus, this is beyond anything I imagined. With this, we can show the world the truth about Judge Thompson and his bias. This is our chance to overturn the injustice." A murmur of hope spread through the room as community members exchanged determined glances. Their shared struggle had found its spark, a secret revelation that promised to shatter the walls of systemic prejudice. In that moment, the quiet resolve of a single young man had grown into a resounding call for change. Marcus stood at the forefront of this emerging revolution, no longer content to be a silent sufferer. His journey through the maze of injustice had not been easy, and his heart still carried the scars of past insults and discrimination. Yet every moment of doubt, every sleepless night spent poring over records, had strengthened his resolve. As the day of the hearing drew nearer, the community's unity was palpable. Neighbors, friends, and families rallied around Marcus, their voices intertwining in a shared dream of justice. "We will no longer be silenced," they declared, echoing his determination to expose the truth. The weight of systemic racism, once an invisible shackle, was now being challenged head-on by the courage of a prodigy who refused to let hate define his destiny. Standing on the precipice of a new chapter, Marcus looked out at the determined faces gathered before him. "We have the truth on our side," he said softly, yet with unwavering conviction. "Our fight is not just for one case, but for every person who has ever been wronged by this system. Today we stand together for justice, for dignity, and for hope." In that charged moment, the spark of revolution ignited into a steady flame, a beacon of change in a city long shadowed by prejudice. Marcus's quest for truth had uncovered not only the dark underbelly of a biased legal system, but also the resilient spirit of a community determined to rise above injustice. And as the night gave way to the promise of a new day, every heart in that small neighborhood beat as one, united in their resolve to transform despair into empowerment. The battle was far from over, but in the silent whispers of hope and the shared stories of resilience, there was a certainty that the seeds of change had been sown. With every document, every conversation, and every act of courage, the foundations of a more just society were being built. One determined step at a time. The courtroom was thick with anticipation, every murmured whisper and shifting gaze a prelude to what felt like an inevitable reckoning. People from all walks of life filled the benches, neighbors, activists, and ordinary citizens united by a shared hunger for justice. The air was heavy with expectation as Marcus, his heart pounding like a drum, stepped forward to speak. He took a deep breath before addressing the assembly. "Today, we stand on the edge of change," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath. "For too long, our community has suffered under the weight of prejudice and injustice. I am here not just for myself, but for every voice silenced by hate." Across the room, Judge Thompson's eyes narrowed. His usual cold demeanor gave little away, but the flicker of unease was visible to those who cared to look. "Order in the court," he barked, his tone sharp and dismissive. Yet the judge's command was swallowed by the rising tide of murmurs and the collective heartbeat of a community ready for transformation. Marcus continued, unwavering. "I have gathered evidence that exposes a system rigged against us. These documents, testimonies, and records prove that our rights have been trampled by bias and that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." He paused, letting his words sink in. His eyes met those of a few community members in the gallery. faces lined with both hope and pain, and he drew strength from their silent solidarity. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Marcus presented the evidence. The documents were laid out with meticulous care, each page a testament to years of struggle and perseverance. "Look at this," he said, holding up a folder for all to see. "Here, the records show a pattern of discriminatory rulings, and here, witness testimonies recount being dismissed with cold indifference." His voice rose with passion, each word a challenge to the long-held injustices of the system. The judge's face turned ashen, his authoritative facade beginning to crumble. "These claims are baseless," he retorted, though his tone lacked conviction. "They are nothing more than a desperate attempt to undermine the court's authority." But his words fell flat against the mounting evidence and the resolute determination in Marcus's eyes. From the back of the courtroom, an older woman, her voice trembling yet resolute, spoke up. "I was there. I saw the disrespect, the way our pleas were ignored. We deserve justice." Her words, spoken with quiet dignity, resonated deeply with those present. The collective spirit in the room swelled, and even some of the officials could no longer hide their discomfort. Marcus's mentor, Mr. Johnson, leaned forward and added, "This isn't just one case, it's a mirror reflecting the bias embedded in our system. Today, we have the chance to shatter that mirror." His tone was firm, his words echoing the shared pain and hope of the community. A tense silence fell over the room as Judge Thompson struggled to regain control. His eyes darted across the evidence, then to the faces of the people who had suffered under his rulings. "You claim to have proof of systemic bias," he said slowly, as if grappling with the realization that his authority was slipping away. "But can you prove that these records are accurate beyond doubt?" His challenge hung in the air, laden with desperation. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied confidently. "Every document here has been verified. Every testimony is a truth that we can no longer ignore. It is time to confront the injustice that has haunted us for generations." His words cut through the tension, a beacon of clarity in the charged atmosphere. The judge's facade wavered as he flipped through the pages. For a long moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a low voice, Judge Thompson said, I will need to review this further." His admission, though reluctant, was a crack in the wall of denial that had long shielded him from accountability. In that pivotal moment, the tide began to turn. The once mighty judge, so accustomed to unwavering power, now appeared small and uncertain. The people in the courtroom exchanged glances of hope and relief. It was as if Marcus's words had ignited a spark, one that threatened to engulf the deep-seated prejudice in a blaze of truth. A young man from the crowd, his voice steady despite the intensity of the moment, declared, "This is our truth. We will not be silenced any longer." His proclamation was met with nods and quiet cheers, each voice adding to the chorus of determination that filled the room. Marcus felt the surge of collective strength, his earlier doubts melting away under the weight of purpose. "We are not here to tear down for the sake of tearing down," he said, his voice softening but still resolute. "We are here to build a future where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Let this be the turning point, where injustice meets its match." The courtroom was no longer just a chamber of law. It had become a battleground for truth and equality. The tension, palpable and raw, was now intertwined with a profound sense of possibility. As Judge Thompson finally cleared his throat, signaling the need to reconvene later, Marcus's words echoed in the minds of everyone present. "We will continue this fight," he vowed quietly, his eyes alight with a mixture of determination and hope. "And we will do so together until every wrong is righted." The moment marked a small yet powerful victory. Although the battle was far from over, the seeds of change had been sown. In the quiet after the storm, as people began to leave the courtroom with renewed resolve, a simple truth emerged. One voice, when united with the hearts of many, could indeed begin to reshape a broken system. As the crowd dispersed into the cool evening air, the whispered promises of change mingled with the fading light. Marcus's resolve had set a new course, a course toward justice, equality, and a future where every person's worth was acknowledged. And in that moment, amid the echoes of challenge and hope, the beginning of a transformation was unmistakably clear. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Thompson's eyes roamed over the damning evidence. The cold authority that had once defined him wavered under the weight of truth. With a tremor in his voice that betrayed his long-held certainty, he finally spoke. "I must review these documents further." His words, though measured, resonated like a crack in the armor of an unjust system. A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. People exchanged glances filled with cautious hope, while the collective heartbeat of the community pulsed in the quiet that followed. Marcus stood at the podium, his hands still steady despite the surge of emotion flooding him. He took a deep breath before addressing the assembly once more. "Today, we have shown that the truth cannot be hidden forever," Marcus said, his voice echoing with both determination and relief. "We have stood up against a system that has too long ignored our voices. This is not just a victory for me, it's a victory for every person who has been silenced by prejudice." A soft cheer arose from the crowd, and among them, Mr. Johnson's proud smile was unmistakable. "Marcus," he said warmly, stepping forward, "your courage has ignited a spark that will not be easily extinguished. You have shattered the illusion that our voices do not matter." In that moment, a palpable shift began. The judge's once unyielding demeanor had given way to a more reflective posture. Though he remained silent for a long while, his hesitation spoke volumes. The very foundations of the courtroom, built on years of bias, were now trembling under the force of accountability. Outside, whispers of the day's events rippled through the community. Neighbors, activists, and everyday citizens felt the tremors of change. "I've never seen anything like it," said one man, his voice quivering with emotion. He actually stood up and challenged that system. Inside, as the proceedings continued, Marcus felt an overwhelming release, a sense of liberation that was both emotional and transformative. He remembered the countless nights spent wrestling with doubt and fear, the painful echoes of racist slurs that had once threatened to drown his spirit. Now, with each word he had spoken and every piece of evidence laid bare, the weight of that burden began to lift. Later that day, in the quieter corridors of the courthouse, Marcus found himself surrounded by supporters who had gathered to offer their congratulations and share their own stories of hardship. "I used to feel so small and powerless," confessed a young woman, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But seeing you today made me believe that we all can rise above this." Marcus smiled gently. "We are not alone," he replied. "Every one of us carries the power to change the narrative. Our experiences, our struggles, they are the fuel for a brighter future." As the courtroom decision was eventually announced, a ruling that called for a thorough review of past cases marred by bias, a sense of cautious optimism began to spread. The judge's reversal, though not an immediate fix for all the wounds inflicted by systemic injustice, sent shockwaves through the community. It signaled the first step toward dismantling a long-entrenched system of inequality. In the days that followed, the impact of that pivotal moment became clear. Community meetings sprouted in neighborhood halls and small churches. People discussed not only the injustice they had witnessed, but also practical steps to ensure that change would continue. "We must hold our leaders accountable," declared one passionate speaker at a local gathering. "This is just the beginning. We have to build on this momentum and demand true reform." Marcus worked alongside community organizers to document more instances of discrimination, using the courtroom victory as a rallying point. "Every story matters," he would say during late-night meetings, his voice steady with conviction. "Our voices, when joined together, can create a chorus that no one can ignore." Throughout these efforts, the transformation in Marcus was evident. Where once he had carried the heavy burden of expectation and sorrow, he now radiated an inner strength born of resilience. His eyes, once clouded with the pain of past insults, shone with the clear light of empowerment. "I realize now that every hardship has prepared me for this moment," he confided to Mr. Johnson one quiet afternoon. "We're not just fighting against injustice. We're fighting for a future where our worth is recognized." The shift in public sentiment was equally inspiring. Local newspapers and radio stations picked up on the story, and soon Marcus's journey became a symbol of hope. In interviews, he would speak simply yet powerfully. "I'm just one voice among many. Together we can make sure that every person is treated with dignity and respect." Even as the wheels of reform slowly began to turn, there was an unmistakable air of determination in the community. Plans for town hall meetings, educational workshops, and even new policies at the courthouse were set in motion. Every small victory was celebrated as a collective step toward a more equitable future. As the sun set on that transformative day, the community gathered one last time outside the courthouse. In hushed tones filled with renewed purpose, they vowed to keep fighting the injustices that had once seemed insurmountable. "This isn't the end," Marcus said softly, addressing the crowd that had become his extended family. "It's the beginning of a new era. We have shown that our voices can change the world." In that quiet, profound moment, the call for equality resonated like a promise that the struggle for justice was far from over, but that every courageous act, every shared story, would pave the way for lasting change. The air was thick with resolve, and each person present carried the conviction that together they could shape a future free from the chains of prejudice. The journey ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But as they dispersed into the night, the echoes of their unity and determination lingered. A single, unyielding cry for equality had been raised, a call that in time would echo far beyond the walls of that courthouse and into the heart of every community seeking to reclaim its dignity.